Dan, was up at dawn tracking down a lost little calf. He didn't want the little one to be in danger any longer than necessary. Dan found the little calf, slung it over his saddle, and headed back to the herd. As they were riding back, Dan thought about how nice a hot cup of coffee would be. And he saw beautiful flowers along the trail. They had white petals surrounding a big yellow center, just like fried eggs. Now he was thinking he would need some eggs along with that cup of coffee. Today, highways often follow the same route as old cowboy trails. Plants do well along the side of the highway because of the edge effect. Vehicles spew out water vapor in their exhaust. In the desert, any water is useful. Our Gemini takes advantage of this extra water and thrives on roadsides. This painting, with its great stories about connections and relationships, is hanging in the gallery as part of our exhibit, Arizona Originals. You'll be able to look at it closely and appreciate the details of those yellow and white flowers with their prickly stems and leaves. And that observation may take you places you've never been. The practice of natural history tends to do that. The Southwest Society of Botanical Artists is a local chapter of the American Society of Botanical Artists, and 15 of our members have gathered 30 works of native Arizona plants for this show. But I hasten to add, this is not a room full of flower paintings. It is brimming with the practice of natural history. In 2011, a conference was held called the Natural Histories Project. Naturally, the director of this institution, Tom Fleischner, was there, and this is his definition of natural history. Natural history is a practice of a focused, intentional attentiveness to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. Tom goes on to say, that kind of attentiveness can be directed towards almost anything. It can be directed towards rocks or landscapes. It can be directed towards hummingbirds in Ecuador. A friend of his, who's a psychologist, now uses that definition of natural history to describe psychology as essentially a natural history of the psyche, a natural history of emotions. I'd like to point out that the word history in many languages, including French and Spanish, is the exact same word used for story. So my premise tonight is that natural history encompasses arts of all kinds, including storytelling. People who study things like this are sure this artwork is intended to tell a story. I would propose that this cave and its paintings would tell each one of us a different story. One of us might want to dig in the cave floor and study the archaeology of the people who lived or gathered there. One of us might want to discover why the cave exists and how old it might be, what natural forces formed it. One of us might want to determine what pigments were used to make those paintings. In fact, there is a woman in the Pacific Northwest who could tell you very precisely what they are because she collects them. But all of us would be observing this same place and discovering a story from those observations. And some of us might want to share our stories. And that's what makes us all natural historians. Dr. Terry Wheeler shared these comments at the Natural Histories Project. It's okay for your definition of natural history to be a personal one. It might vary depending on the kind of question you're asking, or even the kind of mood you're in, or the place you're in. I think that's always been an accepted way of viewing art, but not necessarily an accepted way of viewing science. Natural history spans disciplines. It flows through science and painting and poetry and photography and literature and walks in the woods. It's hard to pin down. I'm not the first person to ask the public to embrace the synchrony of art and natural history. The international trailblazer who set the world on fire with his passion for the natural world was this man, Alexander von Humboldt, born in Prussia, but most definitely a citizen of the world. My neighbor Estelle showed up at my door a few weeks ago lending me this exciting book. Please do yourselves a favor and read it if you haven't already. I'm going to be sharing from this book for the rest of the evening. For those of you who are less familiar with Humboldt, you need to know that he was one of those 1 in a million geniuses who knew a great deal about most things, and he had the brilliance to put it all together in a completely new way. Building on his own education and his reading of the leading thinkers and scientists of the Enlightenment, Humboldt turned the emerging world of science upside down with his concepts of the web of life, climate and vegetation zones, continental drift, the dangers of human activity to climate and ecosystems, and the inescapable fact that man truly is only a small part of the known universe of living things. This is Humboldt's painting. He unashamedly injected poetry and passion into his scientific writings, creating a revolution in world thinking and attitudes toward nature, and influencing countless naturalists and scientists in generations to come. Let's study Humboldt's assertion that art cannot and must not be separated from science. And remember that during the 1800s, the word science began to be used as the new name for natural history. The heyday of natural history was the age of exploration, roughly the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. There was a rush to name, identify, and classify organisms. The study of plants and animals became dry and compartmentalized. Humboldt was about to change all that with an innovative approach to science. Humboldt's first expedition lasted 5 years in Mexico, Central America, and South America. This is what he wrote in a letter in 1799 at the beginning of his voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. I shall collect plants and fossils and make astronomical observations with the best of instruments. Yet this is not the main purpose of my journey. I shall endeavor to discover how nature's forces act upon one another, and in what manner the geographic environment exerts its influence on animals and plants. In short, I must find out about the harmony in nature. When he returned 5 years later to Europe to compile his data, his biographer describes his process this way. Humboldt was now ready to present to the world a completely new way of looking at plants, and he had decided to do so with drawings. Humboldt used this new visual approach so that he could appeal to his reader's imagination, he told a friend, because the world likes to see. It was the world's first ecological book. Until this book, people believed that nature was a mechanical system, like a clock, which could be dismantled and the parts then assembled again. Humboldt was ready to show that nature was a single living organism whose parts only worked in relation to each other. He laid out a totally new understanding of nature, showing relationships between plants, climate, and geography. It was a revolutionary idea. Not only did his books present 5 years of detailed observations about the natural world, but he was passionate about presenting his information in such a way that readers could understand the relationships between different organisms and between organisms and their environment. This sounds perfectly logical to us today, but let me emphasize, no naturalist or scientist had ever said or done this before. He made science accessible. Let me read you a short passage of his own writing and let you judge for yourself. Humboldt wrote, "If I might be allowed to abandon myself to the recollections of my own distant travels, I would describe the summit of the Peak of Tenerife, when a horizontal layer of clouds, dazzling in whiteness, has separated the cone of cinders from the plain below, and suddenly the ascending current pierces the cloudy veil, so that the eye of the traveler may range from the brink of the crater along the vine-clad slopes of Orotava to the orange gardens and banana groves that skirt the shore." This attentiveness is the power of natural history. Botanical artist Jillian Rice likewise uses her powers of observation and attentiveness to tell her story. In describing her painting of the Mexican hat wildflower, she says, "I drew this plant at an enlarged size to show the detail of the disc flowers on the cone-shaped column. As I observed it, I could see how the disc flowers are arranged in Fibonacci spirals, and the ray flowers droop in delightful ways and seem almost velvety. I tried to show these aspects in my painting." She goes on to say, "Wildflowers are challenging to portray because they don't last long once they are picked. When I place them in a jar of water, they change and move about in surprising ways. I must draw quickly, not a simple task when I measure every stem, every petal, and every other part. The more I studied it, the more I learned, and the more I loved it." Tom Fleischner had this to say about natural history, conservation, and love. "In my mind, natural history guided by love is much more effective than conservation guided by fear. And so it is really important that conservation biologists also be naturalists and know the natural history, because it gives them an emotional relationship with what they're trying to conserve." Combining conservation and natural history, Jillian shares with us her personal experience. "Each spring, the Sonoran Desert fills with wildflowers if conditions are favorable. But not everyone appreciates these beautiful wildflowers that attract native bees and other insects. A neighbor and I sowed our first wildflower seeds several years ago, only to receive letters from the city of Phoenix saying a complaint had been filed about weeds in our yards. My neighbor, a biology professor, was able to convince the city that native wildflowers are not weeds and are very beneficial for the environment. The wildflowers won a reprieve. Other neighbors now let them flourish in their own yards, and people walking past my house now compliment the stunning display." This is Jillian's painting that's in the gallery. "In Tucson, I've been inspired to do the same thing as Jillian. I've got wildflowers in my yard. This is the 2019 spring show, and that's Miss Ellie posing for the camera. My neighbors are also falling in love with the flowers. I harvested seeds last year from this bloom, and I gave them to all the neighbors. So we're hoping for another great bloom this spring. I already have poppies in my front yard." Let's return, though, to the Age of Enlightenment. When we left Humboldt, he was publishing his work from that first expedition at the dawn of the 19th century. This is a portrait of José Celestino Matisse, probably painted sometime while Humboldt was exploring the Americas around 1800. Matisse was a Spanish physician and surgeon, commissioned by the Spanish throne in 1783 to conduct the New Granada Botanical Expedition. His assignment from the king was to visualize imperial nature in the New World. To that end, he employed around 60 artists, some for their entire lifetimes, in 4 workshops scattered all over the continent to create nearly 5,400 finished plant illustrations and 1,000 detailed floral anatomies. His artistic product was the shared language of imperial administration and cosmopolitan science. These are a few images from that expedition. The first image on the left, that one, is probably the plant in the portrait. The genus Mutissia was named in his honor. During the expedition, Humboldt visited one of Matisse's workshops in Bogota and reported that no one had ever compiled such a magnificent collection of drawings, nor one on a larger scale. About 3 years ago, 20 of these paintings came to the Huntington in Southern California, and if you ever get a chance to see them, you really should try. They're unbelievable. Let's look at Matisse's portrait more closely. I'll be using the words of Daniela Bleichmar from her book, Visible Empire. The painting invites us into Matisse's study and witness him at work. He is at his desk, deeply engaged in his scholarship. His gaze fixes us with weary patience, as if we had interrupted his silent labor. He lifts his head, but his body remains hunched over in concentration, eager to resume the examination of the flower he is holding. A branch of the same plant lies ready to be pressed between two to become a specimen in a herbarium. The books outline the task at hand. If this plant has already been published, he will determine whether the description is accurate or needs to be updated. If the plant is not in the existing sources, he will be able to describe it as a new species. This portrait is really a job description. The naturalist's job is to observe. Returning to Bleichmar's words, the magnifying lens symbolizes the acute visual skill Matisse possesses as a botanist. A simple instrument, it suggests that the truly magnificent scenery at work is the naturalist's gaze. This is not simple looking, but rather expert, disciplined, methodical observing. And expert seeing is connected to other activities, collecting as evidenced by the plant, the books, and the herbarium, comparing and classifying as signaled by the presence of books, and writing and drawing as indicated by the pen in Matisse's right hand and the sheet of paper before him on the desk. Bleichmar does a wonderful job of describing this portrait. Wouldn't you agree that the artist caught Matisse in the act of practicing natural history? I felt confused about the huge influence of Humboldt on how we understand nature today, yet I was ignorant of his work. And I majored in biology as an undergrad. This is what I learned. During the 19th century, Humboldt became a global celebrity. As a member of a noble Prussian family and friend to two Prussian kings, Humboldt had the social standing to meet important people all over the world to exchange ideas. For example, at the end of his expedition to the New World, he made one last stop in the United States to meet President Thomas Jefferson in 1804. Humboldt was curious to learn about the American democracy experiment. Jefferson wanted to benefit from Humboldt's firsthand knowledge of the resources and economy of New Spain, given the political turmoil going on in Europe. He wanted to know what his opportunities might be. Their meeting lasted only a few days, but their correspondence continued until Jefferson's death, 22 years later. By 1869, the centennial of Humboldt's birthday, thousands upon thousands marched through the streets all over the world, paying homage to the world-famous scientist. And I've got this picture up here because I want you to know this entire front page of the New York Times on September 15th, 1869, had only one headline, and it was Humboldt. That whole page is all about the Humboldt Centennial celebrations in New York, and two columns on the next page. The closest analogy I could come up with was my own memory of the moon landing and how the world reacted to it. That happened exactly 100 years later. This bust of Humboldt was unveiled and dedicated in Central Park during the celebrations on September 14th, 1869. In 1905, Humboldt was still so well known that the settlement of Val Verde, Arizona, right here in Yavapai County, was renamed Humboldt, Arizona. Only a few years later, anti-German sentiment surrounding the First World War resulted in a purging of works by German authors and scientists in many countries. This article from the New York Times in 1918 describes the city of Cleveland encouraging the public to bring their German books to the bonfires. Although more places in the world are named for Humboldt than any other person, today few Americans know about him and his accomplishments. Humboldt, who dared to combine the arts with natural history, inspired countless others to do the same. I'm going to tell you about a young writer whom Humboldt inspired to practice natural history in order to write a masterpiece, a young immigrant scientist whom Humboldt inspired to become a famous conservation activist, and a young woman who was inspired to become the very first biologist in her whole country. First, let's talk about a young man named Henry in Concord, Massachusetts. After losing his only brother in 1842 to tetanus, his grief was still so profound in 1845 that his friend Ralph persuaded him to go to stay in a little cabin in the woods, hoping he would heal. He did. It took 2 years. Henry kept a journal the whole time he was there. When he got home, he knew there must be a book in that journal, but he was at a total loss how to make it work. He kept going back to the pond over and over again, trying to make sense out of his writings and out of nature. After 2 years, he turned over a new leaf. He decided to begin a daily routine of scientific study, morning and evening, with a long afternoon walk in between. And he studied the writings of Humboldt, among others. The grand and spiritual ideas of nature that his friend Ralph tried to share grew to mean less to him as he observed and recorded the detailed variety unfolding on his walks. He wrote in his journal in 1850, "I feel ripe for something. It is seed time with me. I have lain fallow long enough." In Humboldt, Henry found a new and different way to look at nature. His journals mention Humboldt over and over. Henry explored, collected, measured, and connected just as Humboldt did. And he was finally ready to write his own book after studying Humboldt's latest release. Humboldt titled his final and unfinished masterwork with a single ancient Greek word meaning order and beauty created through the human eye, cosmos. Humboldt's vision of nature as a living whole, where organisms were bound together in a net-like, intricate fabric, began with the first volume in 1845. It covered astronomy, geomagnetism, oceans, earthquakes, meteorology, organic life, including plants and animals, even humans. But far from being an encyclopedia, it delved into the perpetual interrelationship between air, winds, ocean currents, elevation, the density of plant cover on the land. Studying this new way to understand nature helped the young man from Concord find his voice for the book hiding in his journal. Walden was Henry David Thoreau's mini-cosmos of one particular place, an evocation of nature in which everything was connected, packed with details of animal habits, blooms, and the thickness of ice on the pond. The foundation of all was observation. Botanical artist Lisa Kearsley describes her process in a way that Thoreau would completely understand. Her own words say it best. "You don't have to walk very far to get a subject to paint. The branch I painted was in our backyard, about 10 feet away from our house. So the take home from that is there is material everywhere to paint. You just have to look around you." And one thing I noticed while I was painting the pine cone was that painting makes you really look at a subject and scrutinize it and see things in it that you never would have noticed when you were casually looking at it. And in the midst of all that focused observation, you become amazed at all that goes into the development, structure, and purpose of the object you're painting. And you realize that the world is pretty darn amazing, even when looking at an ordinary pine cone. And you're humbled by it all and glad to be a part of it. Lisa Kearsley, thank you for doing this beautiful painting. Lisa drove here from Flagstaff to be here tonight, so thank you. Well, her painting inspires me to jump from pines to another conifer group, the redwoods. Young John Muir, an immigrant from Scotland, came of age just before the Civil War. At the beginning of the war, he was studying science and botany at the University of Wisconsin. But in 1863, he deliberately dodged the draft by going to Canada. While in Canada, he worked odd jobs and hiked and collected plant specimens. In September of 1865, he wrote in a letter to a friend in Wisconsin, "How intensely I desire to be a Humboldt." All he could think about was retracing Humboldt's Central and South American expedition for himself. Returning to the United States after the war, he found work at a wagon wheel factory in Indianapolis to save up some money for his journey. Tragically, an accident in the factory struck him blind in both eyes. His Wisconsin friend wrote him these encouraging words as Muir lay in a dark room, blinded. "I have often in my heart wondered what God was training you for. He gave you the eye within the eye to see in all natural objects the realized ideas of his mind. He will surely place you where your work is." Defying all medical predictions, over 6 months, his eyes slowly recovered. And in the summer of 1867, 29-year-old John Muir packed a small bag along with a plant press and a journal, and he began walking from Indiana all the way down to the Florida Gulf Coast. With every mile, he came closer to his Humboldt dream. In Canada, Muir had just collected individual specimens, but now he began to see connections. Muir's intention to ship across the Gulf to the famous flower beds of Texas was confounded when in Florida he was struck down with severe malaria. He was nursed back from the brink of death over 3 months. So he abandoned his plans for the Humboldt-inspired tour of South America and came to believe he needed to travel to California, where the milder climate might restore his health. It's reported that on his very first day in San Francisco, Muir was not fond of the lively city. He asked a passerby for directions out of town. When questioned where he wanted to go, he replied, "To any place that is wild." Now, I guess San Francisco wasn't wild enough. The very next morning, he set out walking again, this time for the Sierra Nevada and Yosemite Valley. Muir was a great communicator and filled his letters, journals, and books with passionate descriptions that transported his readers into the woods and mountains. This photograph of President Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir was taken in 1903 when Muir hosted the president on a camping trip in Yosemite Valley. Those 3 days of listening to Muir lobby for the protection of wild places had a great influence on the president. During his term in office, Theodore Roosevelt signed into existence 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 55 national bird sanctuaries and wildlife refuges, and 150 national forests. On another occasion, when Muir climbed a mountain with Charles Sargent, the director of Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, Muir was amazed how a man so learned about trees could be so untouched by the magnificent scenery. While Muir was jumping around and singing to glory in it all, Sargent stood cool as a rock. When Muir asked him why, Sargent replied, "I don't wear my heart upon my sleeve." But Muir didn't let Sargent get away with this. "Who cares where you wear your little heart, man?" Muir countered. "There you stand, in the face of all heaven come down to earth, like a critic of the universe, as if to say, 'Come, nature, bring on the best you have. I'm from Boston.'" Muir had an encyclopedic knowledge of the plants and animals of the Sierra Nevada. Specimens are not always easy to find, whether they are rare or just extremely well camouflaged. And if you don't have a guide like John Muir to help you find a rare plant, you'll need to rely on other sources. One of our artists in the gallery combined information from herbarium specimens with GPS technology to find her plants. Botanical artist Susan Ashton was asked to make a pen and ink scientific illustration of a rare plant, the Chihuahuan scurf pea, for the University of Arizona Lagoon Project. She describes for us what she had to go through to make an honest, accurate depiction of that plant. This is a rare plant. The herbarium vouchers I was given were really flattened, and it was difficult to figure out what the flowers looked like. They were so wrinkled, and everything was really hairy. Clearly, I needed to find a live plant to study. Herbarium vouchers from the U of A, as well as online scans from SciNet, gave me a list of locations to visit, GPS coordinates, and the likely time of year to go hunting. Trip number 1 was April 2012, and either we were early or spring was late. We got snowed on, but there was only one location where we found the plants. I took photos, measurements, snipped a small sample, which I refrigerated. Trip number 2 was June 2012, and most of the plants were gone. Trip number 3 was at the end of September 2012, and the plants were back. The large underground tuber had produced new leaves and flowers after the monsoon rains. I had a challenge fitting all the information on one page since the plant and its root were so large, and there were all sorts of important details to include. For example, the seed looks like a little brain. It took me until 2016 to finish the piece to my satisfaction. I still think this is a really neat plant. Susan Ashton. Thank you, Susan. This is beautiful, right? Susan's the secretary of our chapter and works very hard on that, besides being a very accomplished artist. In the Natural Histories Project, Robin Wall Kimmerer shared her own youthful experience with the collision of art and science. What really propelled me to become a botanist is that I wanted to know why goldenrod and asters looked so beautiful together. But then, when I went to study botany at the university, they told me very quickly that that was not a science question. That was an art question, that I should look elsewhere for that. In fact, I should really think seriously as to whether I wanted to be a scientist, if that's how plants interested me. I guess her advisor hadn't received the Humboldt memo. It was color that piqued Robin Kimmerer's interest in natural history, and a similar thing happened to Heidi Gustafson. This is her in British Columbia, giving her focused, intentional attentiveness to dirt and rocks. Her studio in the volcanic foothills of the Cascades of northern Washington state is home to a worldwide archive to protect and study ochre. You may wish to be receptive to the story on the page. Oops, sorry. Hopper once remarked, "If I could say it in words, I wouldn't need to paint." Each painting could have been done in many different ways at any point in the plant's life cycle, but the artist consciously chose this subject in this particular position and growth stage and point of view. Why? Did it again. Oh, darn. The honesty each artist has invested in the painting and the accuracy each artist strives to achieve while telling a story about observing that particular plant is an adventure in natural history that has enriched each of their lives. They each invite you to share their experience or have your own personal encounter with the same plant, either through the painting or by finding the plant yourself in our beautiful state of Arizona. I'm going to go back to the other one, because this painting is also by our president, Joyce Pierce. Whoops.
Is it skipping? There you go.
It's just kind of skipping. So this is my pitch for coming to the workshop. I hope you'll take it one step farther and be one of the last 3 people who find a spot on March 7th, where we can learn together how to see. I invite you to follow in these inspiring historical footsteps, or to follow in the footsteps of the artists in our gallery today. With a pencil, a pad, and a magnifier, learn the basics of what to notice about a plant in the wild, and sketch it in your notebook for further study and identification. Observe the connections that plant shows you from other plants in the house. Follow up. Thank you for coming tonight.
We have time for questions.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, then I'll explain to you that up here on the table we have specimens from the Natural History Institute's herbarium of plants that are depicted in drawings or paintings in the gallery. So it gives you a chance to look at the real plant until we can paintings or drawings. Yes, ma'am.
Very often, our drawings aren't things labeled. I noticed nothing in there labeled on the drawing itself. And I wondered if that was a choice for this show or a new way of doing things.
That's an interesting question. She asked why traditionally we see probably older samples of botanical art have their plants named. And she knows that none in this room do. I would say that some. Okay, well, let's let Susie answer that question.
She can use the mic.
Oh.
That's better. The plants that we did for the legumes of Arizona were labeled on a cover sheet when we sent them in. So, for instance, the one that I did for this July scripting had a cover sheet which had brackets, measurements, labeled the various little parts of the flower, everything you could possibly want, but it doesn't make for a really pretty picture. So, the drawings that are on display here don't have those cover sheets, and they don't have all that stuff going with the picture.
It's not a transparent.
Yeah, it was on tracing paper, tracing film in ink. And the people who are doing the book can do whatever they like with that information. But all of us put the scales on the sheets so that, it's like, okay, it's not just one time or whatever, it's like, this was the natural size, usually. And then the parts get magnified and taken apart under a microscope so you can see what they look like.
Thanks. I'd also say that it often depends on what the eventual end use of the painting or drawing is going to be. Back in the day, in the heyday of Victorian botanical art, all of these were intended to be in a book for identification. So you would want the name whenever you want it. Thank you. That's a good question. Anything else?
Great. Well, thank you. Let's give a round of applause. So I invite you to go back into the gallery. There are prints for sale in there. You can find something that's very attractive. And I think Valentine's Day is still coming up. Chance for you to kind of get in good. So thank you for coming out. Come on, look at the herbarium sheets if you wish.